Welcome to the Chronicles of UK Salafism, an insider perspective. This is hopefully the first of many podcasts that intend to provide a chronology of how Salafism developed in the UK, but from a convert and insider perspective. And what I intend to do is to provide evidence, documentary evidence, historical evidence that actually focus on what was being taught and learned during the 90s and then proceed into the 2000s. And the reason for preparing such podcasts is to counter as well as address a prevalent narrative now that Salafism continues to be a precursor to non-violent and violent extremism. And that narrative has been adopted by governments, academics, practitioners, and even other Muslim entities that have been at odds with Salafism and Salafis for decades now. So I think that provision of lectures, titles, the cities, universities, institutions that my own discourses were provided in throughout the early 90s should provide a historical overview and summary of Salafism. And on occasions that will be juxtaposed with the teachings and propaganda of extremist elements that were present in the UK at the time, so that the listener can actually see and discern for themselves whether Salafism is as it's being portrayed and perceived today, and that whether historically it was what it's been accused of being, a precursor to non-violent and violent extremism. And I will obviously start at the beginning of the decade of 1990 when I converted to Islam. And I have my written notes of some of the lessons that we were being taught. And I can mention those without going into too much detail. I think it's necessary to just give an outline. I think it will bore the listener if I was to go through all of the rudimentary aspects of learning that we were receiving at that particular time from the teachers. However, dates I think are important. Context is important to place somewhat of a defense against Salafism, because the typology and the classifications that are prevalent now have placed politicized Islam, especially of the type of Muslim Brotherhood, under the umbrella of Salafism. And equally alarmingly for Salafis, the ideology and theology of the extremists, the Khariji tendencies, have also been placed under the umbrella of Salafism. And I refer to none other than the initial typology upon which many have since developed and referred their own ones. Quinton Witorovic, a colleague that I know and have spoken to many times, developed the classifications of Salafism into three. The first one being Salafi purists, also known as quietists, apolitical Salafis, who are more focused on the spiritual, procedural aspects of the religion. Then you have the Salafi politicos, as he termed them, who are the politicized elements that are dealing with government and wanting to effect change amongst governments and things like this. And then he refers to the Salafi jihadi contingent, those who use violent means, including terrorism, to effect their ultimate objective of change. Now, I think it's necessary to deliver this chronicle of Salafism because providing dates of lectures, providing content and contexts of those lectures will enable a better understanding of how Salafism developed, especially in the 90s. But from an insider perspective, my notes, okay, which are subjective, admittedly, they're subjective, but it still articulates and captures historical aspects of teachings, learning, engagement, discourse, and such like. I also intend to use the framework that I developed in my PhD that charts the development of converts or reverts returning to Islam. And it was a four-stage cognitive framework that included a founding conversion phase, which was for new Muslims, those who were Muslim from young but not necessarily practicing the faith and now returning to the faith. There was a second stage or phase being the youthful phase, which is a formative, overzealous, and idealistic phase. Then you had the next formative stage, adult or foundational phase, and the final mature and reflective phase of development. And I propose using these to chart my own development when reviewing my notes, when reviewing the teachings that I was receiving and giving in the lectures around the UK as I developed as a Muslim and as the 90s developed. I think that's quite significant as well. And the final element of these podcasts, which will be interspersed at various stages where necessary, are, I think, particular world events or national events that may have affected some of my teachings, some of the lessons that I received, or some of the sermons that I delivered where reference was necessary. So, for example, we're starting with 1990 when I converted to Islam. I converted in around the second week of March at Brixton Mosque. Now, the month before that, we saw a huge event take place that resonated across the world, and that was the release of Nelson Mandela on the 11th of February after 27 years imprisonment under the South African apartheid regime. And then we saw the collapse of apartheid start taking place. That had a profound effect on me, and I think accelerated my self-reflection on not only world events, but how I fitted into what was happening around the world, my own identity, and the like. Previously to that, previous to 1990, the 1989 was an altogether formative year for me and a number of individuals who converted in 1990. But I don't want to spend too much time around that, but just to refer to particular events that may have had impact and may have been referenced in some of the lessons, as I've mentioned, and even lectures that I delivered myself. So without further ado, the listener may hear my pages turning of my various notes that I've had and will be referring to, but I want to look at my very first notes that I started recording. I've got some printouts from my teacher, Suleiman Abdul Sabor, who continues to be a mentor for me, and he was the one who taught the bulk of the classes to new Muslims in Brixton Mosque in the 1990s, the early 1990s, alongside another mentor who has passed away since passed, Sarat Abdul Malik, an American friend and colleague who was a very, very influential among converts who converted and started attending Brixton Mosque. So my first notes, handwritten notes I have here, the title is Al-Islam. I don't know if that's a correct phrase, it should be just Islam. And the dates of these notes are between the 20th of May to the 2nd of June 1990. And the very first notes that I have here is talking about Salat, which is an Arabic word meaning supplication or request, and verses referring to that. Other notes then move on to discuss the different prayers and the different units called rak'ah of prayers, the 5 daily prayers. As I said, I don't want to get too clinical and prescriptive reading through every detail. So we were beginning to learn about what is prayer, why pray, who is Allah, who is God, our relationship to Him. The prescription of the prayer was then looked at on the 27th of May, about having intention, preparing ourselves, what needs to be said at the beginning of prayer and during prayer. And I see that the very first prayer, the very first chapter of the Quran that I and my colleagues and all Muslims around the world, new Muslims around the world, learn upon their foundational stages, which was Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening. And interestingly enough, I see my handwritten notes and transliteration of the Arabic, because we were unfamiliar with the Arabic, unsurprisingly, and the only way we could know how to pronounce this new language, these new words, was not only rote learning and repeating after our teacher, but when going home, having something to remind us of that, and it was none other than the transliteration. So that was learnt alongside the 112th surah, 112th chapter of the Quran, Surah Ikhlas, and the final chapter of the Quran, the 114th chapter of the Quran, being Surah Nas. Clearly very short chapters for us as new Muslims learning, and then the lessons of some of these chapters. And I'll move very quickly to look at Fatiha, and jumping back a few days on the 19th of June 1990, or sorry, jumping forward, the 19th of June, we then learned the lessons of Surah Fatiha, one of them being the emphasis of togetherness and being in congregation. The second being to worship none other than Allah. Okay, He is our sole focus of worship. And the fact that this chapter inculcated in us a need and a concern to seek out the straight path. And this is very important to us as converts, because previously and prior to Islam, we followed every and anything that we fancied, if you like, that fit our desires and our understandings at that time. That this chapter freed us from pride, in that we called only upon Allah. You alone do we worship, you alone do we seek aid from. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. The other lesson to be learned from this was that it freed us from superstition, that we praised only Allah and again only asked of Him. And the level of Iman, the sixth lesson from this particular chapter, was the level of Iman, faith, that was required to be a Muslim and a true servant of Allah. So going through my pages, there were more chapters being learned, other lessons. But one of the things that I think was quite significant about the learning at that time, it wasn't until October of that year that we started learning about jihad. And it wasn't a lesson that particularly excited us as young Muslims. It wasn't a lesson that we were repulsed by. It was just another element of learning, and alongside all of the other pillars and aspects of the religion to be learned. And I want to refer to this before concluding on these particular notes, where the title was The True Meaning of Jihad, the 23rd of October 1990, and quote, Jihad literally means striving for the pleasure of Allah and the cause of Islam, close quote. And the reference here was given to the first verses revealed to Prophet Muhammad, and that his wife Khadija, peace and blessings be upon him, that his wife Khadija was the first Muslim after him. And then the stages of the jihad that he underwent are highlighted in the next notes. And the first stage being preaching, the second stage being migration, due to the oppression that he was witnessing and experiencing. The third was fighting only when it was permissible. The fourth was the command to fight those who fought against him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. And the fifth was the later command to fight the polytheists until Islam was fully established. We were given that context of jihad as it related to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him's time. Okay. Then there was another classification given about who to fight, when, who not to fight, etc. And so we have here A, those at peace with Muslims; B, those at war with Muslims; C, those living amongst Muslims and living under Islamic rule and the tax that they would have to pay for protection and their rights to be practiced as necessary within the Islamic environment. And D, this classification of the hypocrites. And I'll read from the notes here what we were taught at that stage about this classification of individuals. Quote, Allah commanded the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to accept their outward appearance as Muslims, but to leave their intentions to Allah and carry on with jihad through argument and persuasion, but not to fight with them. Close quote. So there was the initial context and exposure to jihad for us as new Muslims, unlike what we see today with the misrepresentation, the distortion, and the sole focus on an element of jihad that is expounded upon by the extremist narratives, the extremist propagators in that particular instance. Now, when you juxtapose the extremist teachings of jihad from the initial perspective, the initial premise, compared to what we were being taught on the 23rd of October 1990, it's altogether different. And remaining with this particular context, when we then review the cognitive development framework that I've mentioned at the beginning of this podcast from my PhD, if a convert or revert is being taught a politicized understanding of jihad at the founding conversion stage, this is a cause for concern because their foundation is not going to be upon learning the theology of the religion, the ideological premise of the religion, the life story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and the context within which jihad and other areas of Islam were being taught. And that's a very, very clear indicator of the difference between Salafism and extremist propaganda and politicized understandings. The rest of the teachings for that particular year continued in that vein, learning about more elements of prayer, more supplications, more chapters of the Quran to recite during those prayers. And before, I think I'm looking at the last notes that I had of that particular year, was the continuation of prayer again at a different level and learning the 110th chapter and learning the 111th chapter. And this was all on the 26th of December 1990. So the initial introduction to learning as a new Muslim was around foundational aspects of the faith, rooting us in the fundamentals, rooting us in the focus upon prayer, monotheism, what should be done to draw us closer and firmer as Muslims. So this particular podcast referred to my teachings, what I was learning. The next podcast will look at the year 1991, where there was a continuation of learning, and I will look at elements in more detail and refer to some of the notes, the fiqh jurisprudence that we were learning at that particular time, to help us with and prepare us for Ramadan and prayer, Taraweeh prayers and the like. And I will conclude on that note.